All right, y'all. Welcome. This is how we're going to do things for a bit, at least. Bear with me. This is kind of awkward, kind of uncomfortable. It's kind of weird. Kind of, I think I've said kind of 4 times now. But it is weird talking to nobody. But then you guys are going to watch this, and it's almost like we've had a class. So I'm probably going to struggle through this first video. That's why I kept it to like 15 and a quarter pages, at least for my copy. It's 15 and a quarter. So we're just going to jump straight into it. I'm going to cover some of the more major parts so that we can leave our, the breadth of our discussion open to everybody. First and foremost, right, the title, Wit. Wit means like keenly intelligent, like a keen intelligence, like a really like fine-tuned. They're with it. They've got pretty much whatever kind of knowledge you can expect. They're keenly aware of things. So I would imagine that the Wit is talking about our main character, Vivian. Vivian Baring, PhD, which means she's a doctor. Although I don't know that she'd be able to help out with what's going on these days. So jumping straight into it, kind of structurally, we are, it's kind of unique, right? The first scene is an aside by Vivian, and she's talking directly to the audience while she's got her IV bag, her chemo, basically, all of her cancer treatments. So right off the bat, from a visual perspective, we are given a characterization of Vivian. And one thing that really highlights these first 16 pages is Margaret Edson's use of irony. Margaret Edson's use of irony, but really it's Vivian's use of irony, if we're going to stick to the characters. All right, she gives us a little bit of specific characterization that she is a professor of 17th century poetry specializing in the holy sonnets of John Donne. Now, that's going to come up at least one time in these first 15 and a quarter pages, and I'm gonna point you to some like outside reading, some of his holy sonnets, which most of which talk about mortality and death and life, and the juxtaposition of those two ideas. But how she starts out with the question, right? That rhetorical question, how are you feeling today? And she acknowledges that there's some kind of debate that you can answer, I am good or I am well. Well being like how you are, physically, how your physical body is doing. Good really related to like more like your moral, your ethical conscience. So there's some debate as to the correct response. And yet none of that really matters because when Vivian is asked the question, she mostly says fine. So why even get into that? Why even get into there's two camps when she doesn't fit into any of those camps? And I think the more you read, the more you see that Vivian Baring is kind of her own person. She's very unique. Powerful female character. It's why I love this play. But she says fine, and ironically, she mentions immediately that of course, it is not very often that I do feel fine. Obviously, she's going through all these cancer treatments. And at this point in the play, the very beginning of the play, we're kind of starting in the middle of things. So she has already been going through the intense treatments, the intense chemotherapy, the full dose of everything. So at this point, she's with it. She's keenly aware of the effects that this chemo is having on her. On my first page, one of the funnier things about these first 15 pages, 16 pages, is she's waiting for someone to ask her, how are you feeling today, after she's already died, right? So to me, that makes it seem like she is aware of her mortality. And we get a little bit more of that here on like the next page or so. When she says, they've given me 2 hours to live. That's kind of funny. So she talks about irony specifically. And when authors mention that there's irony, you should listen to them. The thing is, through Vivian, we're kind of expected, because she says so, that irony and humor aren't really the same. In essence, irony is humor. Irony is one of the foundations of humor. And I think she does that consciously. Like, I think she tries to make that separation consciously so that, we focus in on it and can identify the irony and thus the humor. Because think of the subject material of this play. It's a woman with stage 4 ovarian cancer, which I did some research. Women diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer have a 5-year survival rate of 17%, which is low. Not a great diagnosis. And she goes on to even say, she's like, there is no stage 5. So, she has stage 4 metastatic ovarian cancer, which means it's moved to other parts of her body. It's not just localized in her ovaries. So anytime cancer moves, that's not a good sign. And I love this line where she says, "But I think I die at the end. It is not my intention to give away the plot, but I think I die at the end." And one of the questions I have here in my annotations is this is the very first scene, right, quote unquote scene, and she's kind of spoiling it, right? I'm gonna spoil it. She dies, right? But I don't think that's the point. I don't think the point of this play is to lead up to the surprise death. Like, you're already kind of with the statistics, the mortality and survival rate of this cancer, and she tells you right there. I think you're meant to expect it so that you can focus more on the journey to the end of the book, of the novel. And I love that she says they've given me less than 2 hours, which is what the length of the play is. So you should already know that she's not going to make it by the end of this play. All right. And so when I was talking in my Google Classroom comment about the scene changes or the like tonal shifts, those are these lines, like right here, these like centered dashes. Those are we'll consider those scenes. She does in this play, but usually you have scene 1, scene 2. It doesn't really work that way with this one. And immediately this next scene is starting off with some obvious irony. So if you're ever looking for an example of irony, the opening of scene 2, so scene 2. I'll never forget the time I found out I had cancer. Cancer's a big deal, and so you're thinking the way you find out, the way somebody tells you, is going to stick in your mind a little bit. And it's just Dr. Kalikian saying, "You have cancer," and she's like, "See, unforgettable." So that's irony. You're expecting a much more elaborate reveal of her cancer, but you don't get that. Kalikian and Vivian, it's no surprise, and it's no mistake. They're both 50 years old, just like, is it Jason? I can't remember off the top of my head. Yeah, Jason and the nurse, who we don't meet yet, are both 28. So nearly double the age of the resident doctor and the nurse, who are going to become very impactful characters. It's no mistake that they share ages at various stages. Kalikian and Vivian are meant to be foils of one another because of their age, but even Jason and Vivian are eventually going to become foils of each other despite their age. So keep a lookout for that. So when Vivian and Kalikian are talking about her diagnosis, and Kalikian says that it is insidious, right? He knows he's talking to a woman who has a PhD in literature. So when she says insidious, he immediately thinks that, she doesn't know what that word means. And it's not an uncommon word. I'm sure you guys are somewhat familiar with it. And so he's led to believe that she doesn't understand it, so he tries to explain what it means. And he explains it wrong, right? Insidious does not mean undetectable at a whatever. He doesn't get to finish before she cuts him off and says, insidious means treacherous. Cancer is treacherous, so she's not lying. But in this way, the meaning of the word insidious doesn't really matter. So then I love the shift in structure where it's, Kalikian and Vivian side by side, because what it shows is she's not listening at all. She doesn't have to. She can figure this out for herself. She's smart. So he's just going through things, and I love that when it gets to the part about the antennioplastic, right? She's working through her literary expertise, and she's basically breaking down the word, and by doing so, she can figure out what he's talking about without having to listen to him and without having to have him explain things. Mansplain, if you will. So she's concerned right now about figuring everything she can about her cancer on her own. She doesn't need, Dr. Kalikian to tell her. So then it gets to the bottom of, it would be like my 5th page or something, and they're talking about thoroughness. And he's like, perhaps some of these terms are new, I realize. And she says, no, you're being very thorough. And Kalikian takes that as a compliment. But the way in which he's being thorough is like straight to the point, very blunt about her prognosis and her diagnosis and her prognosis. Prognosis meaning like the outcome you can expect to happen. And if it were anybody other than Vivian, I think they would not appreciate that. We like to kind of have bad news sugar-coated. But Vivian likes to be kind of shot straight, so she can figure things out as best she can. She's not given every piece of information. When she does her own, research, she's going to be missing parts. So she leaves it up to herself. And Kalikian mentions hope, the feeling of hope. And the stage direction, Vivian, it says, not so sure. She responds, I suppose. I think immediately upon the diagnosis from Kalikian, she's figuring a prognosis in her mind about, what the next part of her life is going to be, and she can almost sense it's going to end. And what I get from the rest of their conversations is that Kalikian looks at her more of as research. He even says, here is the informed... not that. He says, and as research, it will make a significant contribution to our knowledge. He's not really looking at her as a human being. He's looking at her as an experiment. If they cure her of her cancer, great. But all the stuff they find out in the meantime, even better. All right, because that's kind of his goal. And I think deep down she's kind of absorbing that information, and she recognizes that information, and she knows her prognosis, and it's not great, and so she's probably thinking, well, what the heck, who cares? If I can help somebody else, I'll go for it. Her one caveat is that she's going to have to stop teaching, and she indignantly says, as the stage direction says, that it's out of the question. And then he explains to her the magnitude of this treatment. It's like, it's going to be 8 months. There are 8 cycles of what she has to go through. So, and each cycle is a month. All right. And she has to commit to the full dose, otherwise the research means nothing. So, she's almost like a lab rat or a guinea pig, and I think she understands that and knows that. So then Kalikian leaves, and she's kind of left there to ruminate on her diagnosis, and she's predicting her prognosis, and she has this flashback to when she's a college student, a graduate student, and she's in her focus on the poems of John Donne, and she recalls this conversation she had with her professor E.M. Ashford about the ideas and themes and motifs of John Donne's poems, life and death and everything in between, and what they mean symbolically, metaphorically, and all that. And you're thinking, she has a PhD in this stuff, and so this memory has to be positive, and yet the memory is about her kind of flunking a paper and her professor wanting to meet with her about it. And this is a part that I don't want to get into too deeply because I think we'll talk a lot about it, but this is a particularly impactful scene, like 2 pages, page and a half, 2 pages. because on the surface, on the literal level, it's her having a conversation with her professor about a paper she didn't write very well, about death as a topic. On a much more figurative and more meaningful level, it sets up basically the plot of the play, right? It's Vivian grappling with the concept of life and death and what it means, and how, through John Donne's poetry, how she can interpret the relationship between life and death. And she has to grapple with that from this point forward in her own life as she's dealing with her cancer. At some point, if the prognosis is terminal, you're going to die of your cancer, she has to come to grips with what that means. What do I believe in? Where am I going? What have I done up to this point? There's definite Christian themes, definite religious themes. There's ethical themes, there's moral themes, so keep an eye out for all of these, light bulb moments for Vivian, as she's grappling with all of these decisions that come, one right after the other. So, and I've been telling students for 5 years, all right, not a long time, but I've been telling students for my whole career, punctuation matters. And I'm sure you've seen the meme, the difference between a comma can save lives. Let's eat, comma, grandma, is you're inviting grandma to eat with you, versus let's eat grandma with no comma. It takes a much more sadistic turn. And so this conversation about punctuation between Vivian and her professor is more than just a conversation about punctuation. So hopefully in tomorrow's discussion we can talk a little bit more at depth about what that means and why it's so significant. And so she's left thinking that the relationship between life and death in the John Donne poem that she wrote about in this flashback, it's a metaphysical conceit. And if you'll remember, conceit is just this really elaborate metaphor, right? So this really elaborate comparison, almost like an allegory. Like an allegory is a story that has two meanings. A literal meaning, like if you've read Animal Farm, the book about animals taking over a farm, but on the figurative level, it's a representation of the Russian Revolution with Tsar Nicholas II and Joseph Stalin and Vladimir Lenin and all that. So that poem itself is kind of like an allegory, but now it's going to relate to her life from this point forward. So kind of look at the relationship. So I said I was going to mention a couple poems from John Donne. Obviously he's going to pop up here a couple times. She makes a few allusions, Edson makes a few allusions through Vivian's character. She makes an allusion to Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene. It's a very obvious allusion. She mentions the title of the epic poem by title. It's an epic poem, so it's long, but I would suggest just kind of scanning through the spark notes of what that is about, because she says the Faerie Queene, the Faerie Queene this is not. So whatever happens in the Faerie Queene, don't expect, right? She makes an allusion to Shakespeare with the sands of time kind of thing, right? So obviously, as the sands of time run out, your time on Earth is more limited. And then she does allude to John Donne a couple times. In his Holy Sonnets, 6 and 10, 10 probably being the most famous. I would definitely check those two out. And I might post those in Classroom after our discussion tomorrow, because I'm going to bring them back up. So, but those are things we're going to want to supplement with this work. All right. So after her conversation with her professor, she flashes back to the present moment in time after her conversation with Kalikian, and she says, all right, significant contribution to knowledge. She's resigned to the fact that, she's signed away the informed consent. So she's going to go through 8 cycles of this really harsh chemotherapy. And I don't know about you guys, if you've had experience with family members or anybody with cancer and what the toll that chemotherapy takes on them. But from this point forward, it's going to be kind of, I don't think graphic is the right word, but you're going to get a very in-depth and intimate look into a cancer patient's, an advanced cancer patient's life and experiences, should they have chosen to go this route. But we'll leave off there. I'll meet you guys on the discussion boards tomorrow. We'll probably do about 16 to 20 pages of this. I'm thinking we'll finish it this week. Right, it's a 90-page play. It goes quickly. It's modern, so whatever it takes to get us, through the end of the week. And then I'd like to set up a Zoom or Google Meet call so that we can talk about the play as a whole once we're all finished, and then we can get some face to face, which would be nice for you guys if you're not considered an essential worker, then you're not going out and about. So seeing some new faces of old people, people that can be nice. So till we meet again.